I reckon it all started back when I noticed Janet acting a bit strange. We'd been married for 15 years, and things had gotten comfortable, maybe too comfortable. I worked long hours at the factory, and Janet, well, she took care of the house and our two kids, Danny and Lucy. We weren't rich, but we had enough to get by. One night, I got home late and found her sitting on the couch, staring at her phone. She jumped when I walked in, like she'd seen a ghost. I brushed it off, thinking maybe she was just tired or something. But then, I started noticing other things. Chev DJTM get all dressed up to go grocery shopping, spending more time looking in the mirror than usual. And she was always on that dang phone, texting away with a sly grin on her face. Janet and I met back in high school. She was the prettiest girl in our small town, and I was just a shy kid who worked on his dad's farm. Somehow I mustered the courage to ask her out, and to my surprise, she said yes. We fell in love fast and hard, and before we knew it, we were married with two beautiful kids. Life wasn't perfect, but it was ours. One evening after the kids were tucked in, I decided to ask her about it. "Janet, who you always talking to on that phone of yours?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She looked at me, her eyes wide with surprise, and then she laughed. "Oh, Joe, you're being silly. Just chatting with some friends from the gym." I nodded, trying to believe her, but something didn't sit right with me. Days turned into weeks, and my suspicions grew. I started looking at our bank statements, and that's when I saw it. Money was missing bit by bit. Janet had access to our accounts, but I never thought she'd take advantage of it. I confronted her again, and this time she got defensive. "Joe, you don't trust me?" she snapped, her face flushing with anger. "It's for the kids, for the house. You work so much you don't even notice what needs fixing." I wanted to believe her, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. One night when she was asleep, I took her phone and went through her messages. My heart sank as I read through them. There were love notes, plans to meet, and even pictures. She was having an affair with some guy named Tom. I felt a rage building up inside me, but more than that, I felt betrayed. This woman, the mother of my children, was stealing money from me and sneaking around behind my back. I knew I had to do something, not just for me, but for Danny and Lucy. The next day I took off work and went to see a lawyer. I told him everything, showed him the messages and the bank statements. He nodded, taking notes. "We can file for divorce, Joe, and with this evidence, you have a good chance of getting custody of the kids." It was a long and painful process. Janet denied everything, claimed I was paranoid and trying to ruin her life. But the evidence was clear. The court saw the messages, the bank statements, and they saw how much Chev DTMD betrayed me. The day of the final hearing, I walked into that courtroom with my head held high. Janet glared at me from across the room, but I didn't care. I was fighting for my kids, for their future. The judge ruled in my favor, granting me full custody. Janet got visitation rights, but she was ordered to pay child support. As I walked out of that courthouse, Danny and Lucy ran up to me, their faces full of hope and love. I knelt down and hugged them tight, knowing that we were going to be all right. We'd been through hell, but we'd come out stronger. Life ain't been easy since then. I still work long hours, but now I come home to my kids, and that's what keeps me going. Janet tried to make things difficult, but I stayed strong for Danny and Lucy. They needed me, and I wasn't going to let them down. Sometimes when I'm sitting alone at night, I think about what happened, how I almost lost everything. But then I remember that I'm fighting for my kids, for our family, and that's what matters most. It wasn't just one night or one incident that brought all this to a head. There were countless little signs that, looking back, I should have seen. Janet started going out more, saying she needed a break from the kids and the house. I understood that being a mom was tough, but something just didn't feel right. She joined a gym, which seemed like a good thing at first. She said she wanted to get back in shape, feel good about herself again. But then she started spending more and more time there. Sometimes she'd be gone for hours, and when I'd ask her about it, she'd get all defensive. "Joe, you don't get it," she'd say. "I need this. It's my time to unwind, to be me." I didn't want to argue, so I'd just nod and let it go. But then there were the late-night phone calls. She'd step outside saying it was her sister or her mom, but her voice would get all hushed and secretive. I knew something was up, but I didn't want to believe it. We had a family, a life together. I couldn't believe she'd throw that all away. One night I decided to follow her. I felt like a fool skulking around in the shadows, but I had to know. She said she was going to the gym, but I watched as she drove right past it and headed to a little motel on the outskirts of town. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched her meet up with Tom. They kissed, right there in the parking lot, like they didn't have a care in the world. I felt sick to my stomach. This was the woman I'd loved for 15 years, the mother of my children. I wanted to storm over there, to confront them, but I knew I had to be smart. I took pictures, got evidence. I needed proof, not just for me, but for Danny and Lucy. When I finally confronted Janet with the evidence, she didn't deny it. She just looked at me with those cold eyes and said, "I'm sorry, Joe, but I love him." It felt like a knife to the heart. How could she do this to us, to our family? But I didn't have time to dwell on it. I had to think about the kids. They were my priority now. The legal battle was a nightmare. Janet fought me every step of the way. She said I was a bad father, that I worked too much and didn't spend enough time with the kids. But I had the evidence, the proof of her affair, of the money she'd stolen. The court saw it too. It wasn't just about winning custody. It was about showing Danny and Lucy that they could trust me, that I would always be there for them. The day the judge ruled in my favor was one of the best and worst days of my life. Best because I knew my kids were safe with me. Worst because it meant our family was truly broken. The transition wasn't easy. Danny and Lucy were confused and hurt. They missed their mom, and I couldn't blame them. But I did my best to be there for them, to show them that we could still be a family, even if things were different. We moved to a smaller house closer to my work. It wasn't much, but it was ours. I started cooking more, trying to fill the gaps that Janet left. We had our rough days, but we also had good ones. We'd go to the park, have movie nights, just be together. Slowly, but surely, we started to heal. Janet tried to come back into our lives, claiming she wanted to make things right. But I didn't trust her, and neither did the kids. They'd seen too much, been hurt too much. I told her she could see them, but only on my terms. She didn't like that, but it was the best I could do. Looking back, I realized that our marriage had been on shaky ground for a while. We got so caught up in the daily grind, we forgot to take care of each other. I don't know if things would have turned out different if I'd seen the signs earlier, but I do know that I'm stronger now, and so are my kids. We've built a new life, one that's filled with love and laughter. It's not perfect, but it's ours. And as long as we have each other, I know we'll be okay. The first few months after the divorce were the hardest. I had to figure out how to be both mom and dad to Danny and Lucy. It wasn't easy, especially when Janet was still trying to manipulate things from the outside. She'd call, trying to sweet-talk me into letting her see the kids more often, but I stood my ground. "Joe, please," she'd say. "They need their mother." And I'd reply, "They need stability, Janet. They need to know they're safe and loved." She didn't like that answer, but there wasn't much she could do. The court had made its decision, and I was determined to give my kids the best life I could. One night, about 6 months after the divorce was final, I was sitting on the porch watching the sun set. Danny came out and sat beside me. He was only 11, but he was wise beyond his years. "Dad," he said, looking up at me with those big blue eyes, "why did Mom leave us?" I took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. "It's complicated, buddy. Sometimes people make choices that hurt others. Your mom made some bad choices, but that doesn't mean she doesn't love you." He nodded, but I could see the confusion and pain in his eyes. "Do you still love her?" That was a tough one. I'd loved Janet for so long, it was hard to just turn that off. But things had changed. "I'll always care about your mom, Danny, but sometimes loving someone means letting them go." He seemed to accept that answer, and we sat there in silence for a while, just watching the sun dip below the horizon. It was one of those moments where I felt like I might be doing something right. Lucy was a different story. She was only 8, and she didn't understand why her mom wasn't around all the time anymore. She'd cry herself to sleep some nights, and it broke my heart. I tried to be there for her, to hold her and tell her it was going to be okay. But I knew it wasn't enough. I decided to get the kids into therapy. They needed someone to talk to, someone who could help them process all the changes in their lives. It wasn't an easy decision, and it wasn't cheap, but I knew it was the right thing to do. The therapist, Dr. Morgan, was a kind woman with a gentle demeanor. She worked with the kids, helping them understand their feelings and find ways to cope. She also gave me some valuable advice on how to support them. "Joe," she said one day after a session, "you're doing a great job. Just keep being there for them. They need to know they can count on you." That was easier said than done. Work was still demanding, and there were days when I felt like I was being pulled in a million different directions. But I made a promise to myself and to my kids that I'd always put them first. Janet's visits were supervised at first. She didn't like it, but she didn't have much of a choice. She'd come over to the house once a week, and I'd stay in the room while she spent time with the kids. It was awkward, to say the least. "Joe, do you really have to be here?" she'd ask, frustration clear in her voice. "Yes, Janet, I do. This is how it has to be for now." Eventually, as the months went by and Janet proved she could be trusted, the visits became less supervised. She'd take the kids to the park or out for ice cream. They enjoyed the time with her, but they always came back to me. Our bond was stronger than ever. One day, about a year after the divorce, I got a call from Tom. He wanted to meet. I wasn't sure what to think, but curiosity got the best of me, so I agreed. We met at a diner on the edge of town. Tom was nervous, fidgeting with his coffee cup as he sat across from me. He was younger than I'd expected, and he looked like he hadn't slept in days. "Joe, I know you probably hate me," he started, "and I don't blame you, but I need to talk to you about Janet." I raised an eyebrow. "What about her?" "She's in trouble," he said, looking me in the eye. "She's been drinking a lot, making bad choices. I'm worried about her." I felt a mix of emotions. Part of me wanted to tell him it wasn't my problem, but another part of me still cared about Janet. She was the mother of my children, after all. "What do you expect me to do, Tom?" "I don't know," he admitted. "I just thought you should know. Maybe you can help her or at least make sure the kids are okay." I sighed, rubbing my temples. This wasn't what I wanted to deal with, but I couldn't ignore it either. "I'll talk to her," I said finally, "but this doesn't change anything between us." He nodded, looking relieved. "Thank you, Joe." I didn't see Tom again after that. I did, however, have a serious talk with Janet. I met her at a coffee shop, hoping to keep things civil. "Janet, we need to talk," I said as we sat down. She looked wary, but nodded. "What is it, Joe?" "I've heard you've been struggling, drinking too much, making bad choices. The kids need you to be stable, Janet. They need you to be there for them." Tears welled up in her eyes, and she looked away. "I know, Joe. I've made so many mistakes. I just don't know how to fix things." "You start by taking responsibility," I said firmly. "Get help if you need it. Go to AA meetings, see a therapist. Do whatever it takes to get your life back on track." She nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I'll try, Joe, I promise." I hope she meant it. For the kids' sake, I hope she could find a way to turn things around. As the years went by, things slowly started to improve. Janet got the help she needed and began to rebuild her life. She became more involved with the kids, and they started to heal from the pain of the divorce. Danny and Lucy grew into amazing young people. Danny excelled in school and sports, while Lucy discovered a passion for art. I was so proud of them, and I knew that all the hard work and sacrifices had been worth it. Janet and I found a way to co-parent peacefully. We weren't friends exactly, but we were able to put our differences aside for the sake of the kids. We attended their school events together, celebrated their birthdays, and made sure they knew they were loved by both of us. One day, when Danny was about to graduate from high school, he came to me with a serious look on his face. "Dad, I've been thinking. I want to invite Mom to my graduation." I nodded. "Of course, Danny, she's your mom. She should be there." He smiled, relief flooding his face. "Thanks, Dad. I wasn't sure how you'd feel about it. I want what's best for you and Lucy. If having your mom there makes you happy, then that's what we'll do." The graduation ceremony was a proud moment for all of us. Danny walked across that stage, looking confident and ready to take on the world. Janet and I sat together, clapping and cheering for our son. For a brief moment, it felt like old times, like we were a family again. But I knew better than to dwell on the past. Our lives had changed, and we'd all grown in different ways. The most important thing was that Danny and Lucy knew they were loved and supported by both their parents. Life continued to move forward, and I found myself thinking less and less about the pain of the past. Instead, I focused on the future, on the new memories we were making as a family. It wasn't the life I'd envisioned all those years ago, but it was a good life nonetheless. I found happiness in the little things, like watching Danny play football or helping Lucy with her art projects. I learned to cook, discovering a new passion that brought us closer together as a family. We'd have dinner together every night, sharing stories and laughter. Janet remained a part of our lives, but from a distance. She respected the boundaries we'd set, and I appreciated that. She was there for the important moments, like graduations and birthdays, but she didn't interfere with our day-to-day life. One evening, as I sat on the porch with a glass of iced tea, I thought about how far we'd come. We'd faced so many challenges, but we'd come out stronger on the other side. Danny was off to college, and Lucy was blossoming into a talented young artist. I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't felt in years. The pain and betrayal of the past were still there, but they didn't define me anymore. I was a father, a provider, and a man who had learned to navigate the storms of life. As the sun set on another day, I knew that no matter what the future held, we'd face it together. We were a family, and that was all that mattered. In the end, it wasn't about the mistakes we'd made or the pain we'd endured. It was about the love and resilience that had carried us through. We'd built a new life, one that was filled with hope and promise. And as long as we had each other, I knew we'd be okay.